Welcome back to the channel. This is the Casuals. I'm Jin.
And I'm Saki.
Today's episode is Anime Adventures. And so this segment is going to be really new because today's episode was actually supposed to be memory adventures or adventure memories, sorry. But I thought it was time that I introduced this segment where I really wanted to do this for a while. We only brought this up in passing, I remember, because you were kind of lukewarm to the idea at first, which is understandable. And so this segment's really about anime and what we think about, certain animes that came out or like we watched and generally our experience with anime. And I think we'll start off with our experience with anime. And despite us being, basically growing up together and being really close, we had very, very different experiences with anime and very, very different opinions about anime back then. And so I guess I'll start off first with my experience. My experience with anime started off with, I think, One Piece. One of the most popular manga and shows out there, anime shows out there now. And that's because my cousin introduced it to me. And so after that, I got hooked onto it, and then I started watching more and more anime. And eventually, I just kept on watching and reading, or watching anime and reading a ton of manga. And so, I was basically a weeb, I guess you can call it. I never really went out of my way to buy stuff. Really, I never purchased it. I just only consumed the media. That's it. And so, I was really heavily into anime, but you were very different. I guess I'll hand it over to you now. For now. So, what is your experience with quote unquote anime?
My experience is very little. Even though I am Japanese, I just don't really watch anime. I never found the appeal to it. But I think what's kicked it off was one of our other friends. I forget. I think he introduced me first to Kill la Kill. And we watched that. I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. It's not horrible. And then he was like, oh, you got to watch all these other ones. And, they're the more mainstream ones. And I think I saw a few episodes of, forget what it was at the time, but this was years ago. So he showed me a couple episodes. I'm like, oh, it's kind of like Kill la Kill, just different world, different characters, but same story kind of thing. And so it was just an off-putter. I'm like, okay, I've seen one, I've probably seen most. It's just, same stuff, different name. And so that was really it. That's all I ever really watched until recently, maybe like a month ago now?
Yeah, a month ago,
About
I
a month.
introduced you to another anime. But before we get to that point, when we're speaking about anime, we usually we are people use or when people really speak about anime, they usually refer to the Japanese animations that come out from Japan directly. But because anime is just another form of saying animation, this also would basically be a blanket statement over all animation in general. But it's basically a stylistic type of thing that is associated with anime. But I do want you to talk about. I guess it's not really an anime, but I guess it could still count because it kind of tried at the beginning. It tried following that type of, how do you say it? It's not vibe, but like that type of thing. And you were very into it, which was Ruby. I do want to bring this up for you because particularly you did really like Ruby back then, and I do know that. Would you like to briefly talk about your experience with Ruby?
Yeah, so Ruby is actually more of an American anime, I want to say, because it was made in the States. And so the only reason I got into Ruby was because the creator of Ruby was working on some other little animated shorts that I watched that I really enjoyed. And so when I heard he came out with an anime, like an animation anime, I was like, oh, okay, well, I like his work. Let's try it out. So I remember the first trailer for their anime, and I was like, oh, this looks like a really cool concept. It's different. It's nothing like I've really seen before. So I was like already invested. and then they came out with all the other little trailers, and then after finally their first episode, like I want to say season, I guess, but the episodes, I was like, oh, this is pretty, it was pretty interesting. The animation style was, lacking because it was their very first one ever, so of course it's going to be a little bit different. But after a couple seasons, their, animation and their drawing, I guess, it improved like 100%. Like it was so much better. I don't If you watch it the first like 2, maybe 3 seasons, you're going to be like, my eyes are burning, because it is pretty bad in the animation style. But after, I think it was season 3, season 4 was like it didn't even look the same. It was so different. It was just way better.
And to note why it's changed over time also is because the creator of the RWBY series, Monty Oum, he unfortunately passed away.
Yeah.
In 2015, I believe. Yeah, 2015. And during that time, I believe RWBY was formerly under Rooster Teeth, right?
Yes, they were under.
And so what happened was RWBY was, I think, like basically like controlled by him. He mainly did everything to like from story settings and everything. He basically had almost full control over like RWBY and like what the vision was for the story. But after he passed away, the question becomes who takes over. And so apparently, from what I do know, and I don't want to stir any drama or controversy, but I do know from like other people talking about it, and I guess quote unquote reports that have come out, is that RWBY was eventually taken over by like some people in Rooster Teeth, but they excluded his wife, the person that's closest to him that knew what he wanted, and they took basically full control over RWBY. And I heard after that point, RWBY really fell off. I myself don't know because I never really watched that. I only watched like a couple episodes myself, and it was an interesting concept for me, but I wasn't really into it back then. But from I don't know, would you like to let me know if the quality drastically changed in terms of story writing?
Yeah, the story, they were still trying to follow the original story, but I think they just I think I'm not 100% sure, but to me it feels like they dragged it out a little bit too much. Like I think they're supposed to be 12 seasons total. They're already on 9, and I don't think they're halfway through the story. So I think it's just been dragged out a little bit too much. Because I'm sure, his passing was just, it shocked everyone. So they were like, oh man, we might have to, work double time to get some of this out because he's not here anymore to help us. So they were probably trying to figure out what they wanted to do next with the story. So they were dragging out, the earlier parts of the story, I want to say.
Yeah, and again, they, from what I heard, they completely excluded his wife out of this entire thing, which is strange if you think about it, because his wife probably knows exactly what he wanted, and they kind of just ignored him. But dramas aside, that's just the way RWBY is right now. But yeah, I mean, RWBY is really like another version of anime. I guess you could technically count it as anime now because they also had a Japanese adaptation, which is I think kind of funny if you think about it.
Yeah, that came out later though.
Yeah, that came out way later, but I just thought it was funny that happened. So back to the main, I guess, topic, which is me introducing to you an anime. So about about when we first wanted to start this, whole channel and everything, this whole idea, I brought up to you, it's like, I wanted to introduce you to anime, and you were like kind of privy to the idea. Like, you're not exactly privy to the idea, sorry. Because your experience with the animes was they were basically all the same. So you're just kind of like, well, I'm not gonna be that entertained, which is understandable. Again, just because Saki isn't too into anime doesn't mean he has bad taste or anything. It's just his preference, and nothing is wrong with that. I feel like a lot of people who are into anime bash others, saying like, when people look at One Piece, let's say One Piece, Naruto, whatever the most popular animes out there, and they're like, and then someone looks at them and says, they're all kind of the same, and anime fan base gets really angry, they're like they're not the same, and they bring out the pitchfork. Don't do that. It's just how they view it. We do the same thing, we're guilty of doing the same thing when we look at I guess, American singers, or those famous American singers. We just look at them and they're like, they're all the same in terms of like what the songs they put out. And the fan base for them will get angry, So it's kind of like the same thing. We're just pointing fingers at each other. But you were kind of just like about the idea. And we put off the idea of like watching anime until I really pushed for him. Like I'm saying, hey, why don't I show you like at least 3 episodes of an anime and see if you can determine if you like it or not, right? If you're like mildly interested enough to keep on watching, and you finally caved in because you're like, why not? After I pushed it so far, and so now comes the anime that I want to talk about, and which I hold near and dear to my heart, which is World Trigger. And so World Trigger was the very first anime I ever introduced Saki to, from as far as my knowledge is. And so World Trigger, man, World Trigger isn't that popular, I would say. It's not super niche or anything, nor is it like super unknown, but it's one of those animes that I would say has a small following, but like I guess firm following. And so World Trigger it's very complicated to explain, but I guess I'll explain more as we go on. But let's just talk about like the very first 3 episodes, and if you remember what your impressions was, because I remember excitedly showing you and you were just kind of like okay. And then I ended up showing it to you. So what was your like, do you remember what it was like when I showed you the first like 3 episodes?
Yeah, so the first couple episodes, I'm like, okay, I'm watching it, I'm like, for me, I don't think 3 episodes was enough to like firmly get a grasp if I would like it or not, but I was watching it, I'm like, what the heck is going on? Because, it's only 3 episodes, so you don't really know anything yet. And my impressions was, all right, it's different, after we watched, maybe 10 episodes in or so, I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of on the lines of Ruby, and I love Ruby. And I was thinking in my head, I'm like, okay, so I'm looking out for specific things that Ruby has, in similarities with World Trigger, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's basically Ruby, a different version of Ruby. I'm like, okay, I'm in. And so, yeah, it was just like once I figured that out in my head, I'm like, okay, I'll probably like this since it's very similar to Ruby.
And so I warned you beforehand that the animation, like the first I would say 10 episodes, was really bad. It was hilariously bad. Because and I like to joke about it because like there's 3D models in that anime. This anime came out in 2014, I believe. 2014 is I believe when it came out. And so there was a lot of 3D models in the anime just because it was used for the enemy specifically. So I guess this is where I start explaining the basis of the world. So World Trigger is based in a universe in Japan, set in Japan, in Mikatoshi City. And so the city was invaded by unknown foreign alien beings that wreaked havoc on the city and caused, I think, about 2,000 deaths, about a couple hundred missing, and yada yada yada. And so these alien invaders would later be dubbed as neighbors. And what these neighbors were is that they were immune to humanity's weapons, so missiles, tanks, gunfire, nothing worked on them. And so a mysterious organization named Border came out of nowhere and saved the city by fending off the invaders. And they said their words were, "Leave this to us, we have long prepared for this enemy." And so they used weapons that were not conventional weapons known to man during that time. And when Border finally first emerged, saving the city, they eventually became a big organization, rapidly growing, protecting the city. And so after that point, you would assume that if there was the ground zero for all these alien invasions, people wouldn't be living in that, ground zero anymore. Well, it turns out people actually stayed in the city. Why? Because Border did a really good job at protecting the city. And so, it's it's nothing out of the ordinary when you hear explosions and you know, explosions, gunfire, like alien cries going out once in a while, and so that is like the world setting of World Trigger, and it follows. The main character is really a character named Osamu Mikumo, or Mikumo Osamu, and he is lovingly referred to as Four Eyes. I'm sure you recognize that nickname.
Yes, I do.
And he's your MC that is very different, I would say, at first. And this was during the time of 2014 where there was a lot of like powerful, strong main characters, and even if there were they had like this aura of like the protagonist aura, but Osamu Mikumo, we're just gonna call him Osamu, he was very ordinary. I think when you first saw him, you couldn't even recognize that he was the main character.
He was like, they introduced him as just your average guy walking around,
Yeah.
you know.
You
So I was
couldn't even
like,
tell if he was the main character.
no, I didn't. I was just like, oh, maybe he's just gonna pop in every now and then we were watching it. I'm like, oh, he is the main guy. Okay.
Because you probably thought a white-haired dude that was shown in the beginning was the main character, because he's white-haired.
Yeah.
He's different.
Usually the weird colored hair and like they just look completely different than the regular character models. Usually that's the main character, but
Yeah.
it did take me by surprise that he was the main character.
And so he's a very unassuming, character, Osamu, the four-eyed, or glasses dude. And so, gosh, how to explain this? I guess it would really spoil it, but at this point, the anime is really old, and if you're watching it I would say at this point, if you're curious about the anime, go watch it. I would say go watch the anime first and then come back to this talk, but, moving on, this is, I guess, spoiler territory at this point. Osamu is extremely weak. He is pathetically weak.
Yeah,
and I
he's
think
not like your gym bodybuilder, dude. He's literally just an average guy.
And not to mention, we'll get to this point later. His fighting ability in terms of like being in the Trion body is also hilariously pathetic.
Yeah, he's just an overall weak person. Like he's not physically strong or anything like that.
He's not
literally
talented in fighting in any way. He's not, he doesn't have innate talent with Trion. He doesn't have large strength. He's literally just weak overall.
Yeah, it was a little shocking to me how they made him just like a super weak character. Just like everyone else, is like, oh, we've been training or whatever, so we're pretty strong. He's just like, yeah, I exist.
He's like a leaf in the wind, essentially.
Yeah.
But as you continue on with more in the story and like more episodes go on, you start realizing that even though he's really weak, he makes it up for his like by thinking a lot.
His
brains essentially, and this is not like he's so big brain that like he's able to outmaneuver the enemy every time. It's more like he's smarter than the average person to understand the situation and what he's in order to try and make best what he has. And I think you really appreciated that because he's not like so smart that like he's completely invincible even though he has this glaring physical weakness.
Yeah, it was, I think, like I appreciated the anime more because it was kind of like more relatable. They made a character, he's just your average guy, he's nothing special, but he's just living through life, doing his best. And I was like, oh, that's kind of nice, instead of this one really powerful guy who just does everything. And it's like, okay, well, you see one episode, you've seen them all. It's like, so with him, I was just like, I was more invested because it was more relatable. I kind of like the anime. I like the more relatable kind of things that make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are the ones I kind of gravitate towards. And so when we were watching it for my first watch through, is that what you call it? Watch through? Yeah, so my first watch through, I was just like, oh, this is actually, Oh, I mean, it's not like completely relatable because the aliens and stuff we were talking about before,
Yeah.
but I was just like, oh, the characters are they made of like normal humans, not like these superhumans. So
Realistic humans, I would
yeah,
say. Um,
more realistic. Yeah,
and it's not just him being realistic; it's also his motivations that are also very realistic. And I think like later on, you start realizing why he's so, I guess, stubborn in his like in his reasoning to throw himself into danger every time. And I
yeah,
think like it was kind of like a aha moment when he finally reveals why he he's so stubborn. Like it starts connecting. So World Trigger isn't something that you can like where everything is laid bare from the get go. Um, and I know like a lot of animes are like that these days too. But like back then it was pretty hard to understand. Or back then it was pretty like basic in terms of what the enemy wants, what the characters want, and what like the good and versus the bad is like what they're opposing each other for, right? World Trigger doesn't do that. World Trigger basically immediately starts you off by showing you that portraying that neighbors are bad. The aliens, remember, the aliens are referred as neighbors, and all like they were completely the big bad guys against the humans on Earth. But it turns out that a secondary character that gets immediately introduced in episode 1, and going into episode 2 where everything's basically revealed, not basically everything, but like this like moral dilemma was revealed all of a sudden, that neighbors aren't as what they seem they are. And this brings us to the secondary character that the second major character that shows up is Yuma Kuga, or Kuga Yuma. And he is the white-haired guy that I talked about. And so you were kind of fond of I think you were especially fond of Yuma, um, for his little quirks that he does. Would you like to talk about your impressions of Yuma?
yeah. So Yuma, like he said, is the white-haired character. You don't know. I don't think in the beginning he's a neighbor, but
Um, oh, sorry, slight tangent here. Sorry, we're gonna call him Kuga because I just remembered. Yuma is his last name. I just realized. So we're
oh,
gonna call him Kuga. So
Kuga, sorry.
yeah, Kuga, and you can continue on that. You don't realize that he's a neighbor.
At first, yeah. So when he first shows up in the anime, you don't know he's a neighbor, but there's something odd with him just because his hair is white. It's different from the other characters. So there's something up with him, but you don't know exactly what yet. And so when we were watching the anime and when he was first introduced, I think it was like a car hit him and it did nothing to him, but it did damage to the car. I think it was, right?
Yes. So, oh gosh, sorry. I just realized again. Kuga's is actually his last name, I believe. I completely mixed it up because again, I'm guilty of this. But what's it called? When Japanese names are said, they always say the last name first. So it goes last name, first name, right? But when you look it on like wikis, or like when English says it, they always say first name and last name, first name first and then last name last, right? And so I got mixed up again because brain fart. But his first name is actually Yuma, and his last name is Kuga. But he's commonly referred to as Kuga in the anime. But there is a slight distinction as to why we wanna we call him Kuga just because that's what he's mainly called out of. But for in terms of consistency's sake, I think we'll just call him Yuma. Sorry, Saki. But yeah. So going back to the topic, it isn't exactly implied what happened. All it implies that he was in a car accident at first, and the car was damaged. We didn't really see it happen. It literally just shows them like talking to them like police officers saying it's like, oh, I'm fine, and the guy's like, are you okay? He took the car head on, right? And so something tells us like something's off already about this dude. We don't suspect that he's a neighbor, but something's weird about this dude already.
Yeah, the fact that he could, survive a car hitting him should have been like your first red flag. Like, okay, this guy's not normal.
But
And then, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
oh yeah, but like he didn't seem malicious. he just seemed like he's like, oh yeah, I'm really sorry about inconveniencing you. So,
Yeah, he was like, he's that type of polite character.
yeah.
So
And you
yeah,
were gonna say something.
I was just trying to think what was the second thing that happened with him. Yeah.
So the second thing that happened was he arrived at school. Oh yeah, no. The second thing that was also very like thrown off is that his companion shows up. Replica.
Replica, that's right. I was like, I can't remember his little companion name. It was Replica, that's right. It's like this little floating like
Drone.
drone alien thing. Was it his dad's or something they were saying
Um,
that he uses?
something like that. It's not exactly like that, but it was basically his dad made Replica. It traveled with both of them, and they didn't specifically own each other. Or like one or the other. His father. We'll talk about his father in a bit, but his father or him, or Yuma, didn't really own. Like they didn't specifically say, oh, it's his father or it's his. It's basically another. It's basically a companion. So there's no distinction between who owned it. It's just he was basically a third person in their journey essentially. So Replica is basically his own entity essentially.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense then. Yeah. It's still a little kind of a blur because I've only seen it once, literally once. Each episode was one time. I haven't like done a rewatch. So I'm trying to remember everything that happened in the beginning.
Yeah, the beginning is so far away.
And then there was he didn't know Japanese customs, right?
Yeah, Yuma had no idea what Japanese like I guess like the etiquette, the social like
The culture, I
your
guess.
culture and everything, and even humans in general.
Yeah, so I remember there's Osamu, he was trying to teach him proper Japanese, etiquette and culture. And I just remember just there was one scene where it was like he was like, "Oh, I could buy food," and he pulls out this wad of cash. And then Osama was like, "Dude, don't be flashing money around like that. You shouldn't do that."
It's
And
like bringing out
like a
a
stack of
stack of
hundreds.
stack of 100 just in public. People are gonna look at you.
Yeah, and so
Go
I
ahead.
remember one specific uh conflict they came into was there's a bunch of guys off the street wanting his money. And so they're like, "Oh, hey, can you help me out? My mom is sick," or whatever they were saying, right?
Mhm.
So they're like, "Yeah, I need help. My mom's sick. Can you help me pay for the surgery or whatever?" And so, or whatever the situation was. And he's like, Yuma was like, "Sure." And so he gave him money. And then, after they all asked for the money or whatever, Yuma was like, I forget his line. His line is great. He was like, "You tell the dumbest lies" or something.
Yeah, you make up the stupidest lies.
You make up the stupidest lies. And then he goes on and just beats the crap out of him.
And
And I'm
so
like,
oh, go ahead.
I was just like, yes. I was just like, yes, that is just great.
And so we'll get to that point. We have to rewind just a bit, right?
Yeah.
So it begins with Yuma meeting. So Osamu meets Yuma in school, where Yuma transfers into the school. As to why Yuma transferred into the school isn't revealed exactly yet, but we start getting on. Like it's basically these scenes are subtle or not subtle. They're not subtle at all. Well, they're basically just show off that Yuma doesn't fit in at all. Like even if he's introduced as a foreigner, but even then you're like, well, I saw Replica earlier, this like drone alien looking thing. Clearly he's not a human at all. But it's just basically to put him in settings where like in a school setting where he clearly does not fit at all, right? And so like these bullies start messing with Yuma, and Yuma gets back at them, right? And so how that happens is like they start throwing papers at his head, and he's like, "Oh, what's this?" Right? Yuma's like, "Oh, what's this?" Right? Because he's absolutely clueless about humans in general. And so the bullies were like, "Oh, it's a way of greetings, right?" And he's like, and Yuma's like, I see." And so he crunches up the paper really hard and he flicks it at the guy's head, and then like clearly something is off because like the guy recoils back and falls off his chair, through to the power of the paper. And the bully was like, "What's your problem?" Right? And then that's where Yuma starts his iconic line, you make up the stupidest lies. And so you start realizing that he's able to tell about lies, right? But we don't know why he's able to like tell the person's lying. And so things fast forward, right? Osamu, is worried about Yuma just because of it's in his nature to worry about others. And so he gets involved with Yuma, and Yuma gets called up by the bullies after school, like to hang out and like hang out with them. Clearly, they have bad intentions. They want to beat him up and gang up on him essentially. And so Osamu follows, and they go to what's called the Forbidden Zone. And what the Forbidden Zone is, I'm going to reference this back to Border and like the beginning of the invasion, is that there's a ground zero in all of this. Ground zero. And there's a whole area in the city where basically it's uninhabitable. And the reason why it's uninhabitable is because Border has specifically made that area where the first invasion has, where all the gates are supposed to be open. And what gates are is like basically like, wormholes essentially, where the enemy aliens neighbors can invade through that, which basically kind of like a warp point where neighbors can come through and invade. And so what they did is, instead of having the warps go anywhere in the city, they decided to pull every warp, like basically they forced every warp point to be around that Border organization and within that Forbidden Zone. And so that's why it's called the Forbidden Zone, is because at any time, at any point in time, a neighbor can invade, but they will be forcefully put into that Forbidden Zone, and so humans should not be near it because they can, there can be casualties. And so, bullies take, Yuma out to them along with Osamu, and then this is where the first scene where you start realizing that Osamu is pathetically weak. Osamu gets beat up immediately. And so, you're like, wow, that's new. I thought he was gonna be like, be able to fend off. No, he just gets beat up. And so, after he gets beat up and everything, Yuma scares the, bullies and everything. They're about to gang up. An invasion happens right on top of them. And a thing called Bamster comes through the world and immediately starts attacking one of the bullies. And so Osamu finally reveals who he is, and you start realizing, this man is far more important than I thought. Reveals that he's a Border agent. And this is where he introduces the first trigger on, what we lovingly call the, transformation scene. And so he transforms into a body, and, we'll have to get more into explanation here later on. But basically, he tries fighting off the Bamster, and, Bamster is this, huge, I guess, dinosaur-type looking thing, I guess, is the best way I could describe it. But, gosh. This is where I talked about the budget being. So they had 3D models, and the enemy this Bamster is a 3D model, and that's where we joked that all the budget went into the 3D model, and so the animation quality went down everywhere else. And so he tries fighting it off. He's pathetically weak, can't do anything, and so finally Yuma reveals that he can fight too. So he transforms by using another trigger, and runs up to the Bamster, immediately fucking just decimates him, like absolutely demolishes the Bamster, and then takes out the transformation. And so Osamu's like, who the hell are you, right? And Yuma's like, yeah, I came from the gate. I'm what you call a neighbor. And you're like, what? I thought neighbors were these like, big ass like, monster thing. And then he starts revealing that, there's humanoid neighbors, just like him, like any other human would look like. And so Osamu's completely stunned by this. And so, were you surprised by the fact that Yuma was a neighbor?
Yeah, I was. I knew something was off. He wasn't, a normal human, but I thought maybe he was like one of those super soldiers. But when he revealed that he was a neighbor, I'm like, oh, wait, so he's a bad guy?
That's what, that's like the first dilemma. It's like, is he a bad guy? Like, he clearly is not shown to have any, like, real malicious things, real malicious intent, but he has helped Osamu. So it's like, where does he stand, right? As we learn on more in the story, that he's really just kind of, he's not, like, you start learning that neighbors aren't, it's not simply, like, big alien things that invade people. It's really massive, and the lore implications is very massive, is what I need to say about that. And so we were getting to the scene where he pulls up the fat wad of cash and everything. People try tricking him. So the first one really is when he encounters guys. There's like those people who try doing fraud, where they're like, "Oh, you broke my leg, right?"
Oh yeah, that's right. It was a broken leg first.
Yeah, and then he's like, "Oh, you broke my leg," and then he's like, And then he starts doing that iconic thing where like it zooms on his eyes and then like you hear a heartbeat, right? Like it's some kind of beat, like ding 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 ding, right? As if he's like monitoring their heartbeat for lies. And so and then he's like, you make up the stupidest lies, right? And then he breaks the dude's legs. Or fractures it rather, but he breaks the dude's legs, and then he gives him the money. He's like, "There you go. Now you have the money to go to the doctor, right?"
Yeah, I remember that. He's like, "Oh man, you broke my leg. I need compensation," and Yuma's like, you tell the stupidest lies," and then he actually broke his leg, and I'm like, yes, please. I'm like, yes, justice was served.
And then he wasn't the only one getting after the money. So after Osama left to get food for Yuma because he realized that Yuma's absolutely clueless and he would stand out more if he came with them, he decided to go grab food for Yuma just in case, or grab him food alone just in case. And so he went out, and then 3 more other dudes come out. It's like, oh, this is where the scene is like, oh, my mother is like, badly sick, right? And then Yuma's like, well, if you lie, I'm gonna beat the hell out of you, right? And the guy was like, oh, I'm totally not lying, right? And then Yuma's like, okay. And then he's like, and then you see him do the scene again where like he's detecting lies. And then he's like, you make up the stupidest lies. And then next thing you know, it cuts to the scene of Osamu coming back from like the whatever he bought, right? And you just hear a loud explosion, right? And you see Osama running over, and then you see these 3 dudes just on their like faces, like legs up, and Yuma looking all proud. He's like, and also the implication is that Yuma beat the hell out of them, right? And Osama was like, what did you do? And then Yuma was like, all is right. I didn't break their bones, I think.
That's right. I forgot about that huge explosion.
Yeah. And so, next comes to the real, I think, which is really a really good scene where Yuma and Osabo are talking to each other, right? And, you start learning more about Yuma in general and really Osama and like the type of person he is. And so they discuss each other, and then it's revealed that Yuma came over to this world because his father died. And he apparently told he told Yuma to come to Earth, specifically to Mikadoshi City, to find a person in border, because there's a person in border that said that his father said that would help him. As to exactly why, we don't know, but all we know is that he has a goal here. And so he also reveals that Yuma's like, that his father taught him a lot of things. It's like, you can only rely on yourself. Don't rely on like the laws of the world or even anything like that. Like, and you have to like basically be creative in what you do, right? And you start realizing that despite him being a neighbor, he's pretty, how do you say this, pretty human at the same time. And we can't really call him human because, again, he's a neighbor, quote unquote alien. He is someone who is not from Earth. And so it gets really interesting at that point. Like, you start like, I think at this point you start, I believe this is where you really started, I guess, realizing that it's not, I guess, black and white, I would say, when it's revealed through their conversation. What did you think? Do you remember that conversation they had when they were on the playground and they were sitting on top of that little dome thing?
Honestly, it was so far back, I don't remember exactly what they were talking about.
It's fine. And so, though that's like basically the very beginning. That's like the first 3 episodes. I think it was in the first 2 episodes, in fact. Things get way different later on, but for a good thing. But man, so much time has already passed. It's already getting close to 40 minutes, which is close to our episode ending. So we'll have to continue this next time we record. But I think when we talk about the next following storyline, it gets really fun and interesting. And so I want to reiterate again that for those who are watching this and got into this point and still haven't watched the World Trigger anime, go watch it. I love it. Saki here has really liked it. And so we're gonna end the episode here, but hopefully next time we might even do consecutive episodes, just because these episodes, technically when we record again for this episode, it's gonna be like a couple weeks between this, so we might just record consecutive episodes for this. So you might see this episode come up even next week again, who knows. But for now, we'll end it here. And so, I'll end it off here. So I'm Jin,
And I'm Saki.
and this is The Casuals, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.